This is The Download from Sounds Profitable, the most important news from this week and why it matters to people in the business of podcasting. I'm Newton Chadalkati.
And I'm Gavin Gaddis.
The Download is brought to you by Podscribe. Find out more at podscribe.com.
This week, podcast listening grows while overall listening decreases. Targeting the wide with the niche, how Americans are using their phones at work and podcasts on the commute, and looking back at the election podcast strategy. Let's get started.
This Thursday, from Tom Webster, a recent Edison Research Share of Ear release included a graph indicating audio listenership has returned to something similar to normal listenership in 2019 before the pandemic lockdowns radically changed consumption habits. A quote from Webster, quote, "While the crazy COVID-fueled surge in at-home listening seems to have finally rinsed out, what passes for normalcy is not the 254 minutes of 2015, but the just prior to COVID 230 minutes of 2019. The peak of 254 minutes per day of audio consumption in 2015 has gradually eroded to 234 minutes in 2024, a decline of about 8%. But here's where it gets interesting for podcasters. During this same period, podcast listening in both share and total minutes has actually increased year over year," end quote. In the short term, Webster notes it's more important than ever to have a video strategy and to act on it. Meeting audiences where they are in a world where audio is losing ground means meeting them on video platforms. Another quote from Webster, quote, "The decline in overall audio consumption doesn't have to be permanent, but reversing it requires us to be more intentional about how we position audio content. We need to stop assuming that people will naturally gravitate to audio and start actively selling its benefits. After all, we aren't just competing with podcasts, we're competing with the very notion that audio is worth people's time at all," end quote. It won't be an easy battle or a quick one, but it's one worth fighting.
This Thursday, from True Native Media's Sabrina Nielsen, podcasting has a lot of advertising opportunities, and Nielsen suggests there's underappreciated riches to be found if advertisers head downstream past the chart-topping podcast towards those with more specific interests. A quote from Nielsen, quote, "Despite their specialized focuses, niche podcasts reach a specifically diverse audience that overlaps with the broader, more mainstream listener base. This overlap has significant implications for advertisers looking to connect with highly engaged listeners in a more meaningful and cost-effective way." As Adopter Media's piece on the benefits of long-tail podcast advertising notes, niche topic podcasts historically have less competition for ad space, resulting in better ROI for advertisers that partner with them. This also comes with the added benefit of smaller, tight-knit audiences having more engagement with the host. The same ad spot would have been far more expensive on a large podcast, can still hit with the same audiences in those overlapped interests for cheaper, and the audience will be more leaned in to support a brand that makes their favorite niche show possible versus the latest sponsor in a long line of those supporting a storied, financially successful series.
This Tuesday, RSS.com published the results of a new survey into personal phone usage while at work, built from a survey of over 3,400 adults over 2 weeks in December 2024. According to the data, the average American clocks just over 3 hours of personal minutes on their phone during an average workday. 30 minutes of that time is spent consuming podcasts, with respondents in Texas over-indexing to an average of 59 minutes of podcast per day. Continuing the trend of podcasting connecting with folks throughout the day, Acast has published a new report on podcast consumption during commutes. The report is built from a OnePulse survey of 350 weekly podcast listeners. Of the top 3 activities respondents listed as doing while listening to podcasts, while commuting tied with while relaxing for second place at 48%. Commuting podcast listeners are 22% more likely than overall listeners to be very focused while listening, and 10% more likely to always listen to podcast ads. Both reports reaffirm a long-held selling point of podcasting as both a medium and an advertising tool. Podcasts are a companion medium. They're in listeners' ears while they do the dishes, drive to work, and even while they file their TPS reports.
This Monday, Ashley Carman at Bloomberg dedicated a section of her Soundbite newsletter to an overview of the Sunday Mega article, built by 7 reporters covering 9 podcasters who interviewed Donald Trump during the 2024 election. Carmen uses soundbite to drill down on some key data points discussed, including signs as to how and why the Harris's podcast campaign seemed to fizzle out in comparison to Trump's. One sizable clue is raw view count difference, with YouTube video podcast episodes featuring Trump reaching 113.6 million views, while Harris only racked up 6.8 million. A big contributor to this gulf is Trump having secured an episode of the Joe Rogan Experience, while Harris's campaign could never lock down a viable recording date, as detailed in a clip from Pod Save America that I've linked in the web version of this article. Put a different way, Harris only appeared in 1 Spotify top 10 charting podcast during the campaign, while Trump appeared on 4. Another difference between the two's campaigns is Trump's campaign tended to stay within the gravitational pull of so-called manosphere podcasts, while Harris's podcast appearances varied wildly in tone and topic as she appeared on shows with wildly different focuses and audience, from Club Shay Shay to Call Her Daddy. Finally, it's time for a quick hits. These are articles that didn't quite make the cut for today's episode, but were still worth including in your weekend reading. This week, to start off, something a little non-traditional, but we want to talk about it real quick. According to Pod News reporting, SiriusXM has announced a round of layoffs that impact podcast teams and Earwolf, with 100 roles impacted. With that in mind, we'd like to remind readers that Sounds Profitable hosts a free public job board with open positions from companies in the business of podcasting. We update it daily with new positions as they come in. If you're looking to hire or looking for a new position yourself, we've got over 60 listings currently. You can find them at soundsprofitable.com/jobs. Now into the more traditional stuff. Why ad-free is lazy, the case for podcast ads. An upcoming webinar discussion between Right Side Up's Christina Rubino and our very own Brian Barletta about the myths surrounding ad-free podcasting. That one's happening next Wednesday, February 5th. Keeping the tradition of webinars going, we got one more. Vox Topica's Ask Us Anything. Vox Topica will be hosting a virtual AMA on podcast production Tuesday, February 11th, 3 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Kantar Media sold for $1 billion amid measurement landscape upheaval by Peter Adams. Kantar Media, a subsidiary of Kantar Group, was sold to HIG Capital in a move to expand its measurement capabilities. Next up, we've got Alan Abdeen's thoughts on Call Her Daddy going exclusive. This is a LinkedIn article from YMH Studios' head of ad revenue, Alan Abdeen, as he reflects on the pros and cons of video podcast exclusivity in the wake of Alex Cooper's Call Her Daddy going from Spotify to YouTube exclusivity, and engaging Black audiences, how brands impact, grow, and win with inclusion. The latest entry in Nielsen's Diverse Intelligence series highlights data regarding Black audiences in the United States, with a notable statistic that 73% of Black podcast listener respondents recalled a brand name after exposure, which is 3% higher than the 70% overall rate.
And that was the download, brought to you by Sounds Profitable. I know we went through today's stories fast, so be sure to check out the links to every article mentioned right in your podcast listening app or on the download section of soundsprofitable.com. And thank you for sticking with us as we bring you the top stories you might have missed from the past week. I'm Newton Shuttlecotty.
And I'm Gavin Gaddis. Our producers are myself, Newton Shuttlecotty, Brian Barletta, and Tom Webster. Special thanks to you for joining us. Robot?
Download complete.